Hey, Callie. Hello, 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 everyone. I am going to share this out to everybody. I hope you all are having a great day. Uh, as stated late last week, I'm going to try and make sure that I'm coming on in the evening a couple of times a week at least so that I can get in here on the evening for everybody who's only in the evening, my time, of course. Um, I'm trying to make sure that I'm getting in here a little bit more anyways overall. So I'm going to try and do at least a couple of my nights a week. I do have to warn everybody that by the time my nighttime has rolled around, I have a tendency to be a little bit less functional. So if I'm a little bit less functional, I apologize for that. I'm also live streaming at the same time currently over on TikTok. Camera set up. So you can find any of these lives over on TikTok as well, or not TikTok, I apologize. See, my mind by the end of the day. Over on YouTube, the YouTube is the second one there. The archaeologist is the website, not the me. Um, and uh, you can find me live streaming over on YouTube at the same time. So if you're missing any of the lives or you want to catch up or anything like that, you're more than welcome to go over there and find them. If I have comments off over here, um, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry, some things are new. There we go. So if I have comments over here on TikTok and you'd like to comment, you can always go over to the YouTube channel and comment over there. And I watch it, but I don't watch it quite as close because I watch the screen because I'm looking at the screen. So uh, I've talked about this a couple of times in the last week. This is based on just some things I've seen across TikTok and also different articles that we've seen coming out. So I know that there is a lot of new DNA research for Africa, for across the globe. There's a lot of new DNA research, and the reason there's a lot of new DNA research is uh, the guy who won the Nobel Prize last year. Uh, so Pablo Svante won the Nobel Peace Prize because he invented something called polymerase chain reaction. And polymerase chain reaction is the ability to take a singular strand of DNA and multiply it millions of times. When you're testing DNA, let me put myself a little bit better together. When you're testing DNA, you destroy the strands of DNA you're testing. So the reason that you need more than a singular strand to test is so that you can A, have enough to test in the first place, and B, so that you can do more than one test. And polymerase chain reaction takes that singular strand of DNA and it multiplies it millions of times so that you have a way to test. And because of that happening 20 years ago, we're seeing this increase of DNA research, this increase of DNA research in ancient DNA, this 2 million year old, ability to pull DNA 2 million years old out of the permafrost of the Siberian steppes, like we're reaching a point where we can actually pull DNA out of soil, pull DNA out of air, like all sorts of abilities to pull DNA. And because we have that forward movement happening so much, that forward movement that we have happening so quickly right now is actually giving us an ability to understand things just a little bit better when it comes to ourselves, when it comes to our origin as a species, and when it comes to, really who we are, and the planet itself. So when we're looking at that new ability to test things, most of the finds that they are testing, most of the genomic research that they are doing is not only taking modern day people, but taking people from the past. So not only when they're doing genomic research, are they taking genomes from not genomes. Are they taking DNA from modern people and compiling what the modern genome looks like? But they're taking DNA from ancient peoples and they're compiling what that ancient DNA looks like as well, so that they can put all of that together and get a broad scale picture. The new DNA research that has come across the news for the last probably month, maybe 2 months, um, about how there are some changes in our understanding of our origin of a species is a huge change and kind of halfway a misnomer. So, you know how 6 months ago, oh my God, we found a human tooth at 1.9 million years ago outside of Georgia or outside or in Georgia, outside of Africa, 1.8 million years ago, 1.9 million years ago. It's a human tooth in Georgia. Georgia the city or Georgia the state or Georgia the country, like everybody's all freaking out, which Georgia are we talking about here? So and oh my God, it's 2 million old human teeth, right? It is, but the human is Homo erectus because Homo means human. So when they say human, they're not just talking about us, they're talking about all the humans who have ever lived. And all the humans who have ever lived is a huge family tree at this point. There are 15 subclassifications of Homo erectus, so that makes 16 right there. There is also Homo habilis, that makes 17. And then we get to Neanderthal and Denisovian and Florensis and Lozonzensis and Longi and the Lottie. So that takes us up to my math sucks, but I think that's 23. And then us. So to our knowledge now, and that is not counting the 6 ghost species that we see between our DNA and Neanderthal and Denisovian DNA, because I don't know if those ghost species DNAs are actually the fossils that we have found in fossil record at this point in time. So if we are there and not even counting a possible 6, we are already at 24, right? So when we are talking about humans, we're not just talking about us. And we really want to make sure that we're understanding that we need to decentralize the sapient experience in some of this. We need to look at it at a broader scale, right? We need to decentralize our effect, decentralize how we work the planet based on, and decentralize our experience of humanity based on this, right? Currently, 1, maybe 2 are on the planet right now, Stephen. The question is, how many are on the world right now? Currently, 1, maybe 2. The other question is, so the skulls in Peru, I believe, are sapien. Personally, myself, believe sapien. The giants, I believe that is the Cerruti mastodon fine, personally, myself. And I believe that that is the ghost species that we see in Turtle indigenous DNA. Personally, myself. But that's a personal, right? That's my study and my take and my knowledge wrapped into it. How do we know that bones are of a new species versus just a genetic defect of a pre-existing species? Not always do we know. Um, there are a couple of different hybrid children that we have found that we don't have DNA hybridity on, but we have hybridity based on skeletal morphology that could possibly be a different species or could possibly be one or the other of the seeming hybrids. There are a couple of things that we call derivative of a species. I would use derivative because, or the quotes, because it's just easy or it just rings, but it's basically something that's attributed only to a species. And one thing that's attributed only to us is the Homo sapien chin, which is this mental eminence here. It's not found anywhere else. We are the only species that have it, just like we're the only species with 5 life stages. There are a couple of things about Neanderthal that are derivative or only in Neanderthal. There is like a jawbone shape here, and the way that the back of the mandible and the teeth shape is really just Neanderthal. We have what we think is a hybrid child that has characteristics on the mandible of both Neanderthal and sapien. And so it could be a hybrid child or it could be a whole new species. Right? We don't always know. We can only do the best that we have with the information we have to compile it and put it together and learn as much as we can, right? piece, can I explain which are? Because I did talk about a broader scale of things, so I'm not sure exactly which point you typed and which point it came up in the screen. Um, but first, let me touch on what this new DNA research that modifies species origin is talking about. The skulls. That skull in particular, there's only one skull that I know of like that. We know that, so we have Homo denisovian, but we don't have a skull of Denisovian except for a base piece here. All of Denisovian is under this big except for a piece of a mandible, which might be a little bit bigger, but pretty much all of it fits in the palm of a hand. Um, Longi, we only have a skull, and this skull cap was found in the 70s. We've had this skull cap for a minute, but we believe from, we don't know what Denisovian skull looked like. Longi appears to be its own species because it seems to have characteristics that are unique to it. And that's how we kind of determine something as a new species if all we have is the skull and not DNA, or all we have as a body is things that are unique, derivative, only seen in that species, right? Um, so with Longi, we see a different shape in the skull, and so we think that this is a whole species, but Longi could be Denisovian. We cannot DNA Longi, and all we really have is DNA of Denisovian in a couple of microbones, like small bones, right? So they could be one and the same, or they could be two separate species. That's kind of a couple of examples of two skulls I can think of off the top of my head that are showing things that make us go, wait a second, is that a whole, well, in most of the case, we take it as a hybrid. Longi, we think is its own species. I'm not exactly sure all the dynamics of that. Longi is very new. Um, but with the hybrid jawbone that I know of, it's one of like, there's like, I think there's one other hybrid child thing that we've seen that's not Denny, but I'd have to go back and look on that. So with the origin, what we're looking at is not necessarily um, in all science, in all academia fields, in all things that study knowledge, and all quests for knowledge, there are more than one side. There is more than one group of thought. Um, there are uh, people that believe that the theory of gravity, not the law of gravity, but the theory of how gravity works, is incorrect and have an entire other theory of gravity, right? And some of these are different things that are proven true, right? Some of them, I mean, there are elements of the theory of gravity that don't always work, right? So, um, those two different fields of thought and so those two different views come at it from two different angles. They look at it from two different sides. And anybody who's really open to knowledge and trying to learn is going to look at both sides. So we've always had a couple of different theories of thought on how we start. The theories of thought almost all say, almost all say South Africa and that we come from South Africa. There is a theory of thought that has been predominant that we come from a singular group of Heidelbergensis in South Africa, and that singular group of Heidelbergensis kind of um, evolves into us, kind of like they think Heidelbergensis evolves into Neanderthal. We now know that there are multiple groups of human in South Africa at the time that our species starts evolving. We now know that Homo naledi from 335,000 years ago to 235,000 years ago is in the rising star caves in South Africa at the same time that our species is coming into existence. And they've been there for 35,000 years. They're a beautiful new species. And they've got another 65,000 years of the skeletons we have now. So this could change over time and it could be a larger time frame left to go in their time. We also know that Homo heidelbergensis is there. We know that Homo erectus is there because we know that Homo erectus's last existence that we currently know of is like 170,000 years ago. We know that those other subspecies that we've often spoke about in here of heidelbergensis are there as well. Absolutely. Um, are those other subgroups of Erectus, along with Heidelbergensis, are in that area as well, like Hydo or Homo ergaster, Homo rudolfensis. This list is long, and I never remember all of the names. But there are several other subgroups or what we think are Homo erectus subspecies. They tend to live together in bands. If you do not know, bands is the word for a society or culture that is based on non-ethical grouping or not ethical, non-genetic grouping. Okay. Whereas a tribe is a group that's based on genetic grouping. So, like a matriarch uh, who has 10 daughters, and all of her daughters form separate families within the tribe as it grows. They bring in outside males, in this case, to grow and keep their genetics whole and vibrant, right? A band is several different, in some cases, several different species of human grouped in one space and living together. We know that we did this with Denisovians and Neanderthals because of Denisova Cave. Us and Denisovians and Neanderthals all would live together. We also know that we and Neanderthals lived side by side, a 5-minute walk in a cave or in two cave systems in the Levant area. The Levant area is where Jerusalem, I never know what modern terms are. Sorry, I think it's like the Middle East, but I can't remember if it's the Middle East or it's the Near East. I'm not quite sure. I have a book around here that has the actual, that's all Egyptian. I think it's Near East. It is Near East. Okay, so in the Near East, um, relative for us, uh, when looking at that, we see that we live in bands together, anyways. We probably also live in family groups together. What we're looking at with this articles that are coming across that talk about this new origin of species or the modification of the origin of the species. What they're talking about is instead of one Heidelbergensis group creating sapien through evolution forward, we're looking at multiple subspecies groups, maybe multiple Heidelbergensis groups coming together and creating us. We're not looking at a singular narrow genetics creating us. We're looking at the admixture that is sapien being created. Because the one thing about sapien that is huge is that every single one of us have admixture from other species and from other peoples, ethnicities across the globe. We all have this huge need to move, constant flow. We tend to think that we've been set right here. And there are some spaces that have been isolated from other spaces for a couple of thousand years, maybe. But even in those spaces, we still see that there is genetic flow with other spaces, right? Um, and within that, we see that many spaces have a founding of sapien being there way long ago, and also have a founding. Really, every place on this continent has at least one other ghost species in them. So every continental group or every continent has ghost species. Well, maybe Eurasia doesn't, because I know that there are 3 in Africa, in 2 different spaces in Africa, and I know that in the Americas and in Australia, there are ghost species. So, have unique species that are subspecies or descendant species of Homo erectus at this point. At least that is how we would know that we intermixed with them and were able to come back. Absolutely. Can I please explain ghost species again? Ghost species are species that we see kind of a fingerprint of or a strand of in our DNA. If you can visualize DNA or think of DNA, a lot of us have seen that ladder, that spiraling ladder. And if you can think of taking 2 or 3 rungs out of that spiraling ladder and replacing it with a unique DNA that is something we don't know where it's from, we don't have a genome for. Now, we share a lot of our DNA with every other species on the planet. Like, I think, and I'm bad with this because DNA is not my thing, but I think we're like 95% the same DNA as bananas. Like, we really share a lot of DNA. There's only little unique DNA, anyways. But when we take our ladder, and we take out, sometimes it's like just a light, tiny little percent, like just a brush of hair. Sometimes it's a larger patch. Um, and we replace it with a different species. This is how we see Neanderthal within ours. We don't see the whole genome of Neanderthal within us. We see a little chunk of Neanderthal, and that chunk is your 2% up to 5%. Nobody has more than 5% Neanderthal. So ghost species is that little percentage of the DNA, but we haven't found them in the fossil record yet. We haven't found them anywhere else. Now, that does not mean that we haven't found the species itself in its bones. We have not gotten their DNA. So, two species that we have DNA from are Neanderthal and Denisovan. So we have Neanderthals and a full genome of that, though we have yet to find a Neanderthal Y. The only Y that we find in Neanderthal is one that's more closely related to Denisovians and one that's more closely related to sapiens, Denisovian early on, sapiens later on. But we have found full Denisovan DNA. Every DNA is a unique signature, right? Even if we share our DNA, even if we share our genetics, it's still also unique to everybody, right? So when we're looking at that starting of a species, we can see that we're finding, instead of us coming from a singular group of Heidelbergensis, instead of us descending from a singular group, we're descending from a large nation mostly. Now, I am going to use my own knowledge that I got from non-Western thought academia. To me, this looks like having a large nation with several different bands or tribes. And again, I want to specify that those two words are just the way you trace your inclusion in the ethnicity, the culture, the group, the unit, the however you name your unit, city, state, right? How you decide, like most cities these days are bands, because most cities are made up of multiple people from multiple spaces and multiple genetics. A village where everybody is still, or a small town where everybody is still, we've all been to those small towns where everybody's related to everybody. That's your tribe, right? And it's just the fact that you're tracing it through this or you're tracing it through that. So if you look at a large nation with many tribes and bands within it that is constantly fluxing in, constantly moving. So if you look at all of South Africa, with the understanding that South Africa is everything below that swath of green that you see on the map on the globe. That swath of green is it's like a tropical thing, not the best when it comes to these kind of things, but it's like a tropical area, and it will change depending on year, depending on global climate, right? It will go lower and it'll go up. So everything below this, roughly 300,000 years ago, if you can look at that group as constantly doing this influx, this is what creates us. And in the start of creation of us, you're looking at us. So I want you to think of a group. Think of 3 herds of horses and donkeys. Horses and donkeys are 2 separate species that are unique unto each other, and they are members of the equine group, in the taxonomy, the step above, where we're Homo, they're equine. They're members of the equine lineage. So maybe it's a step up. It might be hominin, step on ours. Sorry. Think of 3 groups that are mixed of donkeys and horses. Now, I believe, and so we're going to use it for this purpose, that it is a male donkey and a female horse that can create an offspring that is viable. We see that because they have a recent common ancestor, they're the same species, like Homo species, same species, equine species. they have a recent common ancestor, so they can mix and they can have babies. And like we know it to currently be, in each group, um, if you have the if you have a viable pregnancy from the horse and the donkey, it's called a mule. When it's born, if it lives to any age of fertility, most likely it's infertile. If it is fertile, it's very rare. We're going to step up the rarity in this. We're going to say it's not that rare. 50% of the time, you come out with a fertile child, but that fertile child is always female and can only breed back to the donkey. It must breed back to the father's line. Okay. So, as you see these three groups, no, actually, we're going to change that last part. Instead of only bringing back to the father's line, they can only bring back to the father's line or to like people who are like animals who are half and half. Okay. So, you have these three herds, and these three herds come together. And when these three herds are coming together, meeting each other in the summer, and somebody's picking out a pretty mare and things like that, you're seeing that more and more children that are half, or more and more foals that are half donkey and half horse are created, and more of these are meeting together. And since it's more likely that they're going to create a child that works, if they're meeting together, they have more of a tendency to gravitate towards each other. And so they also, sometimes they'll go back to the donkey, but they'll go back to the donkey and breed in another group, and they'll move off with that group. And so you see this exchange of genetics. So you see two different groups of sapiens forming, but they're not necessarily different groups of sapien because they're still always a part of this flowing group of mixing. And when they're always this part of this flowing group of mixing, sapien creates. I use donkeys and horses because the words that we have to use with things like this can become extremely problematic when we're talking about humans, and I don't want to do that. But when we're looking at this, what we're looking at is this constant coming back in, this constant intermix, this constant travel, and this constant exchange of genetics. Now we're also seeing that we're going back to the groups that created us as well for our genetics, which means if we're a band that's Heidelbergensis and Ergaster and Rudolfensis, which we see in the fossil record, bands like this. And this band has, a couple of different mixtures created a couple of different Homo sapiens within their group. And maybe grabbed a Homo sapien from this other group that's the brother of another Homo sapien in that group, and brought this in. That we're also breeding back to the Heidelbergensis. We're going back to our ancestral species. We see that from our start, our current thought process is from our start at 300,000 years ago, we start to, have multiple groups that are, again, think of nation with tribes and bands, subgroups within nation. And then taking that point, we are becoming solidified as a singular species. Roughly, I want to say it says 125 to 165. It is in the article. The article is on my website, the widdaord.com, underneath bibliographies and underneath, I think it says new DNA. Let me double check really quick. Human origins. So when we're seeing this, look at this, what we're seeing again is you don't have two distinct groups who are in isolation, who are coming back together. You have many groups who never isolate. And because you have many groups that never isolate, you have this convergence that creates that mixture, that toss a little bit of this and toss a little bit of that and give me some of that, creates the species itself, in my understanding of how I'm reading these things and what that science says to me. So when you're having that broader group, this vast nation that's constantly moving, it's important to understand that we never stop this. We are constantly, like our origin, this amalgamation, this movement across the planet, which is so unique to us. And this come back, go out, come back, go out, taking culture, taking thought processes, and taking genetics. And this is the out of Africa debunk on the bottom. I have seen a lot coming across TikTok and other platforms that talk about out of Africa has been debunked. Out of Africa has not been debunked in the way people want to think that out of Africa has been debunked. The origin of the out of Africa theory is really heavy in racism and really heavy in genetics. And the origin of the out of Africa theory stated that everybody in Europe left Africa 150,000 years ago, because that's the first time we see sapien skeletons outside of Africa in the Levant area. Okay. So everybody in Eurasia leaves at 150,000 years ago, and races are created from that. And I say this with races because race theory has been debunked. Race does not exist. Culture and ethnicity exist. Race does not exist. So this was very heavily steeped in that eugenics idea, that this means that Europeans are advanced. This means that Europeans know more. This means that they evolved further. So when we see this, we have to understand that that is what has been debunked. We have debunked the idea that Homo sapien departs Africa and unique and separate from those that remain in Africa advances for that it is this evolution when it is not this evolution. So when we're looking at that, we do understand in the scientific community, and again, like I said, there's going to be different sides of pretty much every thought process, right? We do overall agree within the scientific community that we are one species, which means we come into space in the same space, because to be one species and to be able to breathe the same way we are, we have to, you can't come here and be the same species. This is speciation in isolation, which we've talked about, which creates Neanderthals and things like that. So we know that we have to be one species to be able to have children as easily as we do. We did have children with Neanderthals and Denisovians, but it was not easy, and those children weren't often fertile. So when we're looking at the out of Africa origin being debunked, what they're talking about is the idea of a single time out of Africa and then everything else starting out here being debunked. When we're looking at where we all start, our knowledge, absolutely not. Give me a second. Our knowledge currently is that in South Africa, we all start. It is now known that it's through a very genetically diverse group. This genetic diversity is what makes us the amazing mothers that we are. Because if we were not genetically diverse like this, we would not be able to populate the planet in many different spaces. We wouldn't be able to adapt. That's it. We wouldn't be able to adapt. And we not only adapt, but we adapt the surroundings, which other species do, and then we adapt our adaptations, which only we do. And because of this, we see that it is this genetic diversity, this meeting of many thoughts, this meeting of many different groups that creates this ability to become who we are. I will absolutely explain the difference between race and ethnicity. So, ethnicity is something that is based on culture and genetics. It's based on family lines. It's based on where you've been. It's based on experience as well. We know this doubling down these days scientifically because we know epigenetics, which means that the trauma that happens to your grandparents and your great grandparents is printed in your bones, right? So, ethnicity is about your family line. It's about your ancestors. It's about your space. It's about being a part of a culture in a space. It's very much rooted as well in culture. Culture and ethnicity are very intertwined. Ethnicity can have a wide range of colors and a wide range of looks within a single ethnicity because ethnicity is about family, again, family lines, and space. So if you are several generations down, you might be ethnic to a space because you've sunk into this space. It's about, immigrating into a space rather than, you know, conquering a space, right? So race is about the thought process that your your phenotype, visual things that other people can see, denotes your intelligence level, whether or not you can handle pain, what you're able to do for a living, as in, are you strong or are you weak? And different levels along these things. Race as a theory is created. Well, it really starts in its idea in 1492 when we see the Europeans land on the Taino people. Before this, they equate science and medicine as sin. So most of Africa that is not indigenous or animistic at this time is Islamic, and so they can say that it's a sin and that they can make it a religious thing. They're othering because othering is important to those who want to stay in charge and rule you. So um, they can't say it's that anymore, and they need a reason to destroy people. They need a reason to justify their atrocities. And the reason that they come up with to justify their atrocities is this is the mark of Cain. Uh, for those who understand the biblical story is Adam and Eve, their two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. Cain is banished. Cain kills Abel because God tells him to, but God, being the narcissistic father he is, then punishes him for doing what he said. And uh, Cain is outcast. Cain's son Ham is given a chance to redeem himself, I believe, and fails in that redemption chance, and so is marked. And Christianity, Europeans, when it comes to uh, the Americas, it names it as dark skin as being the mark. So racism starts there. The idea of a race starts there. These are all the descendants of Cain, therefore they are marked. And all these lily white, which is where we get the terminology, Europeans are the descendant of Adam and Eve's other children after, because they then went on to have more children. So, who married other people who were standing over there. So then when we get to the knowledge that so when they find Neanderthal, when Darwin's theory of evolution comes out, they realize that the Earth's not 6,000 years old and this didn't work. So now they have to find a new reason to justify, again, their atrocities because they are atrocious. And in this justification for atrocities, the theory of race and the theory of eugenics is created. The theory of eugenics is created in Europe. I think Jefferson actually was like one of the people who actually worked on the theory of eugenics that Hitler used, right? So the theory of eugenics and race is created at this time, and the theory of race being created, they again go with phenotype. They also use oh god, I can't remember what skeletal or skull morphology is called for the theory of race, but the skull morphology, they also use that as well. Now, all of these things have been debunked. They literally would put paint on a piece of paper and hold it up and go, "You're this shade." The pencil test is a favorite one, or not a favorite one, a famous one. They'd stick a pencil in your hair, and if it fell out, then This is in apartheid, if it fell out, then you were white, and if it was stuck, then you were colored or black. Um, when you and I do distinguish those two groups because of apartheid, not because those are preferred choices of language, um, or because that's how apartheid distinguished them. When you're looking at that, you're seeing that this shift into race as an othering was really, again, just that justification for atrocity, and that the tools that they used were artists' tools, which are great. And whatever for the science of the time, but really debunked when we get to actual scientific tools. Once we get to the ability to genetically test people, we find that genetic diversity within a primary population is greater than genetic diversity between two primary populations, which means if you are from South Africa, originally been there, and your city, space, wherever you are, is all South African. And somebody is from Sweden, been there 7,000 years, the earliest people in Sweden, 300,000 years in South Africa. So you're from, you're going to share more genetic similarities with somebody in Sweden than you are with your next door neighbor. And if you think about this makes common fucking sense, because otherwise we'd be inbred. We don't mix with people that we're genetically similar with. You don't go with your cousin, because then you're inbred. You go for people who are genetically diverse from you, because the more genetic diversity, the less mutations, the less problems that we have. So when you see that people are less genetically diverse, communities that don't have any outside, and we know of a few that, like I know there's a couple communities within the United States that have come over a couple hundred years ago and then isolated for religious reasons, and we don't see genetic diversity within that, and we see an increase in mutation. So genetic diversity within a primary population is highly important. So this tells us that the idea that I am genetically well, I'm a bad example, I'm from everywhere, but the idea that somebody in South Africa is genetically distinct from somebody in Sweden is bullshit. You're more likely to be genetically similar to somebody across the globe than you are to your next door neighbor, so that you can have more babies with your next door neighbor and continue the species whole. And this is how the theory of race has gotten debunked. You can read about this with the whole genome study. Pretty much anything in genomics these days has shown that. And this is the difference between race and ethnicity. Again, ethnicity is absolutely about genetics. It's absolutely about shared experience. Race is about fantasy and art, and the assumption that skin color or phenotype has anything to do with genetics. We now know that skin color, hair, eyes, all of these things are really based on where we're at in the globe and how long we've been somewhere as a group might change those things. Adaptations to a space takes 100 generations. So for us currently, it's 2,500 years. Speciations takes adaptation and isolation, meaning adapting without any intermixing and admixture, which we just don't do. And that's the other thing. When we're looking at the idea that people in Africa are an entire ethnicity, and people in Western Europe are an entire ethnicity, and people in Asia are an entire ethnicity, and people in North America are an entire ethnicity, and people in South America are an entire ethnicity, we ignore the fact that nobody has stayed still for 300,000 years. We have constantly, 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 constantly moved. And this is how that diversity happens for the first few generations. Not only for the first few generations, but forever, right? Because there's a constant flow of our species, and it's not one way. It is never one way. We know that it's not even one way here in the Turtle Islands in the Americas, because we know that the X1 mitochondrial DNA starts here and is found in Siberia in X2, which means the mother is here, the daughter is there, right? So we do talk about the INC ending. Not right now, probably in this, but we absolutely do see that there is this constant back and forth flow, this constant movement. Hi, Rosie. This constant movement. And this constant movement, right, is really important to us constantly keeping up that genetic diversity, and constantly keeping up that exchange of information, constantly keeping up that exchange of ideas that creates the sparks that we are unique for. So when we're looking at the things that make us unique as a species, what we see is that we have mandatory midwifery. We must have help birthing our children because of the size and the shape of the skull and the shape and the tilt of the pelvic outlet. Of course, there are cases where this does not happen before you throw them at me. Usually it's you've got a small skulled baby and a larger pelvic outlet woman, or you have somebody who is extremely flexible. But anything else, it is very mandatory. So this means this, along with the fact that I have 25 life or 5 life stages from neonate or birth to adult, roughly 25 currently, which means that's when the frontal lobe is fully closed. Because we have those 5 life stages, we're the only species that has that. Between that and mandatory midwifery, we have to be communal. We must constantly have other people around us to help us raise our children. We cannot raise our children in isolation, so we cannot isolate. When we look at that and we look at the fact that we literally, so Homo erectus is the only other human species to make it outside of Africa. And to our knowledge, the only other hominin species to make it outside of Africa. Homo erectus makes it outside of Africa at 1.8 to 1.9 million years ago, is our current evidence with the tooth in Georgia. So that means that Homo erectus, to our knowledge, being roughly 2 million years ago currently, was 200,000 years into its time as a species when it first steps foot outside of Africa. We first stepped foot outside of Africa at 150,000 years into our time as a species. At the same time, we're seeing that we've finally converged as it was 135, wasn't it? It's 135 to 125,000. So at this point, this amalgamation of species that creates us in South Africa has finalized into Homo sapien. And this Homo sapien is leaving Africa roughly at the same time that it's amalgamized. Now, we do know that we have 3 ghost species within the 2 communities that we see in Africa that do not have Neanderthal. There are only 2 pre-colonized communities within Africa that did not have Neanderthal, and that is the Kwe people of South Africa and the Oyo people of West Africa. Within those 2 communities, we see 3 ghost species. We also see the greatest genetic diversity within the Kwe people. This article talks about the Nama people, and I do not know if this changes that information that I've had up until maybe this article of the Kwe people being the most genetically diverse. It might change it because I'm not sure if the Nama people are a group of the Kwe, because I know the Kwe is a broader group, not just a small singular group, right? It's more the nation than the different states within the nation. So we do see that it is in South Africa that we have the greatest genetic diversity. So we do know that this is the origin population of our species. This is where we start. So as that conversion happens and we head up into our start of our first movement outside of Africa, we're really very early into this stability. We haven't even developed this brain shape yet, because this brain shape fully develops between 40 and 30,000 years ago. So we're seeing that in that movement out, it's so early on in our time. That's something that we do. We are constantly moving, and we are constantly curious over what's over the next horizon. And this really comes in something that we get from Homo erectus that we take to the next level. We see that Neanderthal did this, but Neanderthal didn't do it quite the way we did it. Neanderthal is like 570,000 years in their time on this planet. Neanderthal beat us by the time we were born. So it's not like we outlived them. Neanderthal had us beat by the time we were born. But even in all of that time, they never took it this far. Now, to me, some of that is a disconnect that Neanderthals never had. Neanderthals never disconnected from their animism, from their place in the evolution of the planet, the forward movement. They never disconnected in the way that we have. But it is also, I think, within that 5 life stages, because that 5 life stages gives us more malleability of our brain than anything else. All other species on the planet have like 5 years at the most from birth to full adult. Some things are born and walk off, right? Like some things never have a mama, right? So nobody else has this extended life stages between. And what it is that when it takes us 6 months to get from neonate to, or I think that it goes neonate to toddler. So it's 6 months to get from neonate to, or a year and a half to get from neonate to toddler, or a year to get to neonate to toddler, right? That time is our mind seeing the whole world around us, developing colors, developing, and then we enter into the next stage. So we get this extended period of development in that initial stage that nobody else has. These things create this brain that is constantly looking for something new, constantly questing. We are the only species that takes our adaptations and adapts them. We see that Homo erectus did that before us. They took the Oldowan tool complex that we actually get from Paranthropus boisei, another new thing, not from Homo habilis. They see that the Oldowan tool complex, or we see that the Oldowan tool complex shifts when Homo erectus comes into it. And Homo erectus takes that tool complex into the Acheulean hand axe. We see that it shifts again when you start getting into Neanderthal. We see that it shifts again when you start getting into us. We see that Neanderthal is really the first to take it to something you can put on a spear point and use as a spear. Whereas we're really the ones, to our knowledge currently, that take it into bow and arrow. We are, to our knowledge, the only ones who used atlatls, spear throwers, or bows and arrows. We believe that there is something in the shoulder girdle that would make it harder for Neanderthals to use those items. This does not necessarily mean that this is set in stone. We might find that this is wrong, right? We also believe that we had a bunch of male Neanderthals until we realized that the larger Neanderthals are the female Neanderthals and the smaller Neanderthals are the male Neanderthals, and we still can't find one of their Y DNA, right? So there's a few different things that we're still learning here. We see, though, that shift and that change of the tool usage is something that is really big for us. We are really the only species that we see that doesn't build the same house it started out with, right? So everything else can build a house and build a home. The beaver has been building the same style of house for its entire existence, really, right? Whereas we took our initial house and we changed it and we adapted it, and then we adapted it and we adapted it, right? So when we see this, we see that that is unique to us. This indicates that something that is unique to us is our creativity. Something that is unique to us is our spark. Part of that spark is that diversity of thought. And it's really logical if you think about it. If I've lived my entire life inside this box of thought, if I've lived my entire life believing that there's only one plane of existence, it's going to be very hard for me to conceptualize that there are other planes of existence. Now, if somebody shows me the evidence that there are other planes of existence, then I might conceptualize that there are other planes of existence. But if I've never stepped outside of that, I'm never going anywhere with it. Mushrooms help, but not all of us. I don't see things on mushrooms. I mean, some people don't have, I mean, hallucinogenics make me realize that I already hallucinate. Like, I mean, that's kind of what hallucinogenics have done for me. But so when we see that that understanding of that shift of us into, excuse me one second, I need to Turn on a fan. It's getting too hot in here. When we see, sorry, YouTube. When we see that, what we see is that that meeting of minds not only is in our origin as a species, not only is important to who we are as a species, not only is it important to how we create, how we make, how we have advanced so far, it is also important really all the way up to now. So after we get to a point where people have nation states, city states, where you have people in charge of you who have decided that they're in control and they need to be able to control you, we don't see us staying in one place. The idea of living and dying a mile, from where you were born isn't for half of society. There is, of course, the half that stays. There's always the half that stays. That's an important part too. It's never more than half, right? It's always so many of us constantly moving. When it is not constantly looking over the next horizon because we know what's over the next horizon, it becomes merchanting, it becomes traveling, it becomes going to visit your relatives, it becomes this constant movement. We see this in the Iron Age. We see this all the way up, really, until we get firm city states. And even in getting a firm city states, even when we get underneath the control of kings and churches and things like that, we still see that there are always explorers. There are always people moving. There are always merchants. There are always people applying for these licenses. There are always people who are not born and die in the same space. There are some people who have been in the same space for 300 generations. Chatterman's 300 generation great grandson is a mile from where Chatterman was found in England, right? Still, you see that there are always people that are moving. You see that the rest of Chatterman's DNA or mitochondrial group, the group that he belonged to, is spread across Northeast Europe, or yes, Northeast Europe, right? So, sorry, East Europe, not Northeast. They get weird on me with the way that it programs in my head. East Europe. So they're Eastern European that's why West. That's what I was getting backwards. So Western European. They're part of that Western European bloc. About 13% of the Western European groups are actually related to the mitochondrial group that Chatterman was related to. So that DNA is all up in there. It's constantly still moving. When we look at things like the Bell Beaker people, we see 3 unique DNA groups with the same culture. So even when you see that there's not a lot of the movement of the DNA, you still see that that culture is constantly in flux. And that culture is constantly in flux with that merchanting, that constant movement. It's important to note with the Bell Beakers, what you're looking at is a Germanic group versus a Celtic group when we're talking about unique DNA. So these groups are still moving. They're just not moving from Germanic to Celtic because this is the timeline, or they're right before those timelines. And so their groups become these groups later on. So with the Germanic group, you might find that it's moving up across the northern part of Eurasia from the steppes all the way over. And we absolutely see that language-wise and genetic-wise, that absolutely happens. And then with the Celtic group, you might see that it's moving across the lower half of Western Eurasia. So when we're looking at that, we're constantly seeing this movement in flux. This is what happened as we left Africa. We moved out and we went back in. We moved out and we went back in. We moved out and we went back in. So when people talk about out of Africa being debunked, what they're talking about being debunked is that single exodus. We still all start in Africa. We just don't leave once. We leave and go back and leave and go back and leave and go back. There is this constant flow of humanity. And that constant flow of humanity picks up Denisovian along the way and picks up Neanderthal along the way, takes Neanderthal back because it mixes with Neanderthal There's new evidence of a new find in the Arabian Peninsula of another site where Neanderthal and Homo sapien are constantly interchanging, constantly mixing genetics, constantly in that time of discovery, right? Two brains meeting, that explosion of understanding. So we see that we start mixing with Neanderthals at 150,000 years ago when we start leaving Africa and go into the Levant area. And in that time frame, what we start to see is there is this shift in all of our understanding. So we know now that Homo naledi is 130 or 335,000 to 235,000 years ago. This is our knowledge currently. It could change. Lieberger is going to be putting out some more finds over this next year. He's already stated that. But one of the finds that he put out, and the big one currently, is that naledi buried their dead. This is not something we see again until 90,000 years ago. So the time that we are becoming created, naledi is there. This DNA article talks about they do not believe that naledi is one of the contributors for us because they're morphologically different. Their brain, everything about naledi is really morphologically different from us. The only thing they share with us is the shape of the brain, which we do not have at that time. We have a brain shape case that's more similar to Neanderthal or Erectus, and the lower body from the L spine down, which they share with us and Erectus and Neanderthal, that expedient bipedalism. But their upper body is all Australopithecine, like Lucy, and their brain is really small, but the case is shaped like ours is, globular, that round, and lobal with different lobes. So we start with naledi in the area doing these things, but we're not really picking up on it. It's not until 90,000 years ago that we see first with the Neanderthals and then start to see it within us later, the first evidences of burial. The first evidences of cave art come in at like 63,000 years ago, and this is Neanderthal, not us. It doesn't come into us for another 20,000 years. We start to see that there is this explosion of understanding of identity, and that only happens after we start mixing with Neanderthals, after we start this interaction. Again, this is that example of the fact that every time we meet, every time there's that admixture, every time that there's that new thought process, every time that there's that new understanding coming into our purview, we explode with thought, we explode with knowledge, we're curious and we're creative, and our brain expands. So we see that burial and cave art and self-decoration comes before the brain shape comes. We now believe that it is the shape. We have a brain that started out like this, being the forehead, being the spine, being the back. It starts out, well, I think it starts out a little bit more like this. Some of them are kind of up, some of them are down. A little bit diversity as the first like 50, 60,000 years comes. So we're seeing starting like this and then morphing to this. Now this is 300,000 years ago. This is 30 to 40,000 years ago. This shape creates the lobes within our brain and creates the globular shape of our brain, which they believe is what causes that synapses firing at such a high speed. They believe that the difference between us and Neanderthals currently is that our synapses is fired faster. I'm not sure there was much difference. I'll be really honest. I think that they were just so small as a group by the time that they met with us that there's this, the explosion of thought goes both ways, but they hadn't met with us before. So they hadn't grabbed that explosion of thought before. And as they're being enveloped within us, it's coming along, right? I do not believe it is the envelopment that causes the shape of the brain, because we see that brain shape even in spaces that didn't envelop Neanderthal. They do have those other species within them, the ghost species, but they do not have Neanderthal. So when we look at that, we can see that from the creation of our species, it takes constantly intermixing with others and not being in isolation for us to not only start, but to constantly grow, to constantly move, to constantly further our expansion. It doesn't matter what point and what continent we found ourselves on, even on the continents, we would mix. If you look at North America, Turtle Island, you see that from the southern tip of, it's called Mexico now, to the plains of the Midwest in the United States, uh, all roots back in the same proto language, the Dene proto language. You see that the Dene proto language starts again over at the northern point of California up into Canada. So you see that the Dene language group is this vastly migrating language group that is individualizing into different nations with different languages as it goes on, just like Indo-European differentiates into Germanic, differentiates into Latin, differentiates into Gaelic. So you see that it differentiates into different groups as it goes along, but you see that they start as the same group of people, constantly fluxing, constantly migrating, constantly moving. You see this in South America, in Abya Yala, where you see constant trails, constant. The Peruvian mummies that they just got DNA from out of the shaft of lice excretion on the hair, with the follicles of hair within that shaft, the cement that the lice made on them. They just extracted DNA from that of humans for the Peruvian mummies. There's like 3 of them. This is an article that came across recently. I believe it's on the website. That DNA shows that they have migrated several thousand miles. Like, they did not start where they ended up. We show that there is this constant movement even here. I have not put too much study and effort into Australia. I just haven't yet. Like, it just is not. I've done so much in other areas. I just have not studied that continent at this point. I do know some facts and I do know some things. I would assume from the things that I know that there is a lot of migration going there, but I do not know of archaeological evidence. I do know of some archaeological evidence of things like the fact that they have a unique ghost species in them that's not seen anywhere else, and that we also see that they have one of the highest percentages of Denisovian, and that we also see that they're there for 70,000 years. So we see that, there's a lot of beautiful evidence there too. I am sure that if we look at that, we will see a lot of movement. I know even today that there's a lot of movement within Indigenous Australians anyways, to my knowledge. So I can totally see where there's that constant flux of movement there as well. There is just this need to constantly interchange. I think that these things are really important when we're looking at new information coming across, that we can look at that from a Western thought likes to lump everything into a specific thought process that is very narrow and only looks at, that's very centric. So it only looks at it through its own eyes, right? So when we're looking at all of these articles through a Western thought standpoint, we fail to see the underlying of what could possibly be happening or what is more likely to actually happen, because 30,000 years ago, nobody thought of the Greek gods. Like, nobody was out there worshiping money and Zeus 30,000 years ago, right? So, thinking that 30,000 years ago, people were thinking the same as 2,000 years ago is really blind, right? So not being able to understand things from a more animistic standpoint, or not being able to understand things from a less Western thought standpoint, can be very difficult. And trying to parse these articles that are all written from a very Western thought standpoint, a lot of times these articles can come across as saying things that they're not saying. But the way that they are wording it, or the way that they're, well, and things like this is a gotcha. Everything about this title is a gotcha. Let me click you. Let me get you in, right? And this was something that I had seen several different articles come across about it with several different titles before this one came across. So I kind of knew what it was talking about. But this would have, what the fuck do you mean, new origin? Like, what, Just like the human tooth in Georgia. What the heck do you mean there's a human tooth? Oh, you mean an erectus tooth. That makes sense, right? So when we're looking at these things and we're looking at these articles, it's important to understand that it doesn't modify most people's origin. It just modifies the very narrow specific origin. Most people can see that it wasn't likely Adam and Eve that created 10 of us, right? Like the idea that we're coming from a singular species is just as genetically narrow as the idea that we're coming from two human beings, right? So understanding that there's always this broader mix, I think for a lot of us has already been there within science. And I think that for a lot of us, even in a more common thought process and non-academic thought process, that there has been this understanding that it's a little bit more of a blender, right? It's a little bit more of that constant admixture. And it's, I think, important for us that it is how we are created compared to a lot of these other human species. So Neanderthal is really the only one other than Erectus that outlasts us. Because you see that Erectus is 2 million years and Neanderthal is 600 to 500 and no 600 to 30,000 years ago. So 570,000 years, right? So they're both outlasting us. But we see within Erectus, they're probably coming from an amalgamation of a couple other species at the time. Like they're always broadly several different species anyways. With Heidelberg or with Neanderthal, you're seeing Neanderthal is really only coming from Heidelbergensis. The Heidelbergensis is the only species that we're seeing in Western Europe at the time that Neanderthal is speciating. So Neanderthal is coming from a singular species. We see that Neanderthal, we believe that they were more genetically diverse earlier on and that they went through two almost extinction phases, and those two almost extinction phases narrowed them down. Before those almost extinction phases, they had already replaced their Y-DNA with Denisovian Y-DNA. After those, or actually, I think even before the two extinction phases, they had already started to replace the Denisovian with the Y-DNA, because I think the Y-DNA that we have for Homo sapien and Neanderthal is over 200,000 years ago. I think it's like 200, but that might be, yeah. Anyway, sorry, numbers getting bigger make it harder for me. But we see that there's this replacement. To me, this is because you see Denisovian coming from a singular species, or not Denisovian, and Neanderthal coming from a singular species. We see that Denisovian currently, we believe, is like, I think they think like 400,000 or 500,000 years ago because of some DNA, because of the Y DNA within Neanderthal. So I think they think that it's 400,000 years ago for Denisovian. And then they think 13,000 years ago for its end. So they've been here longer than us so far, or they were here longer than us so far, by roughly 1,000 or 100,000 years, but they're still very narrow genetically to our current knowledge. When we see things like Florensis, we're seeing a species that only seems, well, okay, so I have to quantify that, or qualify that. So currently somebody is looking into the fact that Florensis might still be alive. So it's possible that that species starts at 100,000 years ago and is still alive today. I think that the oldest that they have on Florensis is like 100,000 years or 150,000 years ago. I'm not exactly sure. Longi, we only have one find of. Sorry. That is so loud that way. Longi, we only have one find of, so we don't really have a timeline for Longi, but I think Longi's like at 60,000 years ago. I'm not sure. And Luzonensis, I think that they put that at 100,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago on a couple of the charts I've seen, but I'm not sure because Luzonensis is so new. So we're looking at, and then if we look at Naladi, currently we have evidence from 335 to 235. That's 100,000 years of existence to our current knowledge, right? So when we're looking at these other species, they seem to have come from more genetic narrowing than we do. They seem to have come from a singular species as compared to us, which makes sense to me. When we look at this, see that there just has always been this form of admixture, this form of constant interaction, this form of constant movement. And that this constant movement has really moved us across the planet. It doesn't keep us in one space, it doesn't keep us isolated. Because we've never been isolated, we don't have the ability to become unique races, and we don't have and will never become unique species. To become unique species, we have to be in isolation. Or, well, okay, so or having several genetically distinct yet capable of intermixing groups mixing, right? So it either there would have to be multiple human species left, not just us. We would still have to have Neanderthal and Denisovian and all these other species still on the planet and constantly be intermixing with them to be able to come up with another species without it being isolation. To me, it's just what makes us unique. It's part of who we are. It's why we're who we are. Any questions? I think I've gone over the subject itself as pretty extensively as I can, though it might not always make sense, which is why if there's any questions, I'm willing to answer them. Uh, but I think the subject itself, I'm just going to be repeating myself at this point, unless it's something different or a question. So if there's any questions, I'm totally open to them. My camera follows me, YouTube, sorry. It doesn't suggest we came from anywhere else. There's a lot of people that think out of Africa theory has been debunked. There is conversation that out of Africa theory has been debunked in the scientific community. And what this means is the theory that we all left Africa at 150,000, well, not all, that Europeans left Africa at 150,000 years ago, and then we're hanging out all by themselves. And that's why Europeans are so advanced, is a theory that was really created along with race theory and eugenics. And it itself has been debunked. We now know that there's never a singular movement out of Africa. There is a constant flow both out and back into Africa, and it never stops from the very beginning. We do know that we start in South Africa as a species, that Homo sapiens starts in South Africa as a species. Current evidence shows that we start in South Africa from different groups of humans actually coming together and mixing together. And it is that different groups of humans mixing that tends to create us, that gives them the creation of us, or that makes us come into being, into speciation. Whereas other species end up coming into a speciation due to isolation, where Heidelbergensis isolated in Eurasia becomes Neanderthal. And I think we think that Denisovian comes from Ergaster, but I'm not sure if we think Denisovian comes from Ergaster or Heidelbergensis at this point. But whichever species it comes from is because of isolation in West Eurasia or East Eurasia that creates Denisovian. Whereas it seems that Homo sapien is created by many of the subspecies of Erectus all kind of mixing together, is what the new DNA research talks about with the human origins. The reason we were talking about out of Africa debunked with the question mark on it is because there's a lot of people coming across talking about, well, out of Africa was debunked. And they try to use that to say that it doesn't mean that we came from Africa, or that it means that we didn't come from Africa. And that's just false. To all current understanding, to scientific, we have to be the same species to be able to breed and have babies as easy as we do, period. If we're two separate species, our breedings are going to not always be viable. If they're viable, they're not going to always be fertile. So to everything that we know scientifically, we have to be a singular species to be able to breed the way that we do. And to everything that we know scientifically, currently, it takes starting in the same space to be a singular species. So everything that we currently know is that within South Africa is the start of our species. This title here talks about the idea that we now know that it's, you know, we look at many of the groups of Homo erectus. Some people look at them as different species, and some people look at them as subspecies of Homo erectus. So, welcome. So we see that those that see the subspecies of Homo erectus are like Ergaster, Heidelbergensis, Rudolfensis, many of the other species. I have a list of names somewhere. I'd have to go and dig it out. Um, come from, or like we see them, we'll see like two or three Ergaster and two or three Heidelbergensis and two or three Rudolfensis and two or three Erectus all in a cave in, right? So they were all camping together. They were all living together. They were one community together, and a cave crashes on them. So we look at this as them being bands anyways. So basically what this is stating is that we're coming out of those bands. We're coming out of that genetic interchange that's very broad and varied. And so having many species in the same space intermixing in that same space is creating us. But again, it must be in the same space for us to be one species. And again, for all of our knowledge currently, it is absolutely in the same space in South Africa. This is where we're seeing the first of our species. We see that our species starts to move out of Africa at 150,000 years ago. Roughly at the same time, this new evidence says that we converge as a singular species. So Homo sapiens, starting from this diversity of so many different species. If you have a band over here that has, or a state over here that has like 10 Homo sapien children in it because of all their intermixing, and a state over here that has 10 Homo sapien children, and one over here that has 20, and as they're mixing together, all those Homo sapien children are breeding together better and easier. So now they start forming their own band, right? And by the time that it becomes like a singular of a species, it's about 25 to 35,000 years ago, which is after we've really started to move up into the Levant area already. So we're seeing that we're up into the Levant area, and that's where we start mixing in with the Neanderthals. And then we stay there for 100,000 years, with the exception of the indigenous Australians who are out of the Levant area and in Australia by 70,000 years ago. So out of Africa hasn't been debunked, and the idea of all of us originating in Africa being debunked, that has not been debunked at all. What has been debunked is the very racist concept that we only left once, or Europeans left once, and Europeans isolated themselves in Europe and got evolved. I mean, I don't want to bag on anybody, but some things seem backwards in the evolutionary thought process to me, and definitely not forward in that got evolved thought process. But we definitely see that it is not debunked in the idea that we do all absolutely come from Africa. And our current knowledge is we do all absolutely come from South Africa. Time might change that. It might be a little bit north, but the idea of us actually starting as a species somewhere else, we have an overabundance of evidence in South Africa at this point. So it would have to be something that negates all that other evidence. As in, like, I mean, if we find of Homo sapien outside of Africa, a singular one, and it's carbon 14 dated to 400,000 years ago, we might go, well, shit, what is this? We might have to take a closer look. It's not going to change our entire perspective until we can make sure that it's not a hoax, right? Because so many hoaxes have happened. And then if it's, factual and real, then, a singular skeleton outside of Africa at that point in time isn't going to disprove like the multiple skeletons that we can see like changing, right? And like the way that they're speciating even, or even debunk, the DNA knowledge that they have. Like they can look at certain populations of South Africa have all the genetics, all human genetics are found in those populations, because we know that these are the original populations. They're the populations that stayed behind. and dug into the earth and became beautiful, proud, nations in themselves, and have beautiful stories, right? So there are populations that stay behind, and those populations have the oldest languages on this planet. And we can, well, most of the oldest languages. We do know that there are some old languages in Australia as well. But most of the oldest languages on our planet are seen there. And we also see that we can trace mitochondrial DNAs back. Like there's just so much evidence that proves that it would be, to debunk a preponderance, as they say, of evidence, you would need a preponderance of evidence, which means an overwhelming amount of evidence. To debunk an overwhelming amount of evidence, you need an overwhelming amount of evidence. We have absolutely debunked the idea, though, that Homo sapien left Africa at 150,000 years ago and stayed in Europe and made their own special little group up in Europe. Thank you for the heart. And we've absolutely shown that there is a constant pattern of movement and migration, both in and out. And we've absolutely shown that that we start, that we move out, that we go back, that we move out, that we go back, that we move out, then we go back, and then we move out, and then we go back. There was a find from England, Britain, from 790. No, it was later than that. Maybe it was earlier than that. It was earlier than that. It was right before Lindisfarne. So I think it's like 793, but I could be mixing my dates, but I know it was before Lindisfarne, of a little girl who was 11 years old, who had 33% West African DNA. Her maternal aunts were buried with her. And they were both Western European DNA, the same Western European DNA that you see being for 13% of the population of Western Europe, right? And the same DNA that they connect to Cheddarman. So 2 aunts were buried with her, but she had 33% West African DNA from her father's side. This is in the late 700s, right? There are 2 Viking graves in England that have men from West Africa in them. Hey, Mary. That have men from West Africa in them. So we see that even in the time period where everybody's like, oh, we weren't doing nothing, we were still moving. There are mummies found in China that are from Scotland, when Scotland was actually Scotland, like in kilts, right? That died on the, died and were mummified by the actual like environment around them. There is the girl with the corded skirt, the Ikret girl, Ekgert or something like that. They can trace the isotopes in her teeth to show that she migrated from the very top of Western Europe to the very bottom of Western Europe to the very top of Western Europe through her life. And she was not very old. She was in her mid-teens. The Burqa Shield Maiden, BJ581, the grave that I study, they have DNA on her. And their DNA on her shows that she had Iberian DNA, had Lithuanian DNA, had Danish DNA, and had so Iberia DNA, Hebrides, and Irish, right, where it's mixed there. And then Danish, Lithuanian, like there's another one in there too. But she had like DNA from everywhere up in there. And looking at the isotopes in her teeth, we knew that, no, we don't have her teeth. Sorry, that's somebody else. Because we were missing her skull. We had it when we found her, but we no longer have it because early archaeologists were grave robbers. But we know from her DNA that she was from everywhere. Is that mine? Okay, I have to double check and see that this is the person that I think it is. It is. If you are not following this person, you should absolutely be following this person. Um, this is one of the people that I consider family that I was raised with, who makes beautiful, beautiful, like I beautiful earrings. The mask that I wore all through the pandemic was made by this one, this creator, and this beautiful family member. So please follow that creator. I don't think that they have been doing a lot of TikTok, but they should be, and they need more followers. So you can see that there is this constant migration, this constant movement through, this constant flow. And it is absolutely that constant flow that is absolutely what gives us that uniqueness, what gives us the ability to understand different things, what gives us the movement forward and the understanding of new creations. If you are, if you've been flint knapping the same knife for the last several generations, and you meet somebody new and he flint knaps differently, then you're going to go, oh, well, I was taught this way. You mean I can do it differently? I thought I could only do it this way. Well, now that tells me that I can do it maybe a whole new way. Maybe I need to find a whole new way, right? Any movement, any meeting, any interaction. And when you double it down with the fact that we just always needed community too, we've always needed that vast branch of community. We've always needed that vast conglomeration of us to really be able to move us forward, to really be able to survive. We often think like, oh, a mom and a child in a cave, that would have been fine. That would have worked. But the thing is what we don't understand a lot of the time is that I alone am not going to go out hunting when I have a club or when I, have a wooden spear, right? I alone am not going to go out hunting. I alone am not going to go out and gather berries or water or reeds or anything else that I might need to gather, um, because of the fact that it's at a time period where I am small and I am meaty compared to the other beings out there, right? Like saber-tooth tiger is not going to come into your cave. There's fire there. There's laughter. There's a lot of stuff. They're not really attracted to that. They're going to go find easier prey. But you're easier prey if you're out by yourself, right? Those separated are easy prey. So if you're talking at a time where you can't even go and get water without having multiple people to protect you, to make sure that you're safe, you need multiple people in a community. It seems to me that a lot of Western thought and a lot of Western science sees worth only in what I do for my community, right? And don't get me wrong, what we do for our community is extremely important. Yet we are worth everything just by being, right? Our worth doesn't have to be what somebody else can get out of me. Our worth is literally the fact that we're here continuing our species. And when we're looking at prior groups, I mean, today, let's be real. There's a lot of us that, we're overpopulated, right? We seem to have gotten into our head that the more that we can breed, the better. Like that our job is to be locusts on this planet, when that's really not true. So, maybe now we don't need everybody. Yet when there's only 100 of us, 100 of us are all valuable. If there's only 100 of us and we haven't built stone walls yet, if there's only 100 of us and our spears are still being made in the fire because we haven't started flint knapping spears yet, so it's still just a wooden point that we've ground down because we like sharpened it by burning it and ground it down, so we've got a really good spear here, but it's still a wooden spear, you know um until we've gotten to this space where we're living in four walls and everything is an exchange of cash, we're not finding safety in singular lives. Not only that, but Anybody who's ever raised children knows that raising a child on your own or raising a child with just one other person is a ridiculous thought process. We need multiple people to raise a child. Children are full of energy nobody else has and have no clue what stop means, you know? So when you're looking at communities at a time frame where it's not this time frame, you're looking at communities that have to have multiple people within the community so that those multiple people can keep us all alive. So therefore everybody has value and worth within it. And if that value and worth is the fact that you're just sitting in the cave making sure the fire doesn't go out, or you're, chasing down the toddlers inside, or toddler, because there's not usually multiples, um, you're seeing that that value and worth is still huge and still there, right? And this is where that idea of community comes into play. And really that idea of we constantly intermixing. And we're constantly intermixing because really pleasure is something we're fond of. And people are something we're fond of, right? And we don't really get this idea that other exists until way later, and somebody else tries to give us that idea so that they can control us. So before, when we're seeing other species or other groups, every single bit of evidence we have says we had fun every step of the way, right? Every single bit of evidence we have shows that. So between the 6 species in the fossil record and the 6 species that we see in the ghost species in our DNA, we can see that if we discount the ones that we don't see, we don't know whether or not we had any mix with them because we don't have any DNA from them, and just look at what we have in our DNA, we see that we literally mixed with 7 other species because we have 5 ghost species in Denisovian and Neanderthal. So we're seeing that we literally are just out there mixing with everything we're coming across anyways. I think that for us, that, kind of companionship, that constant need for community really comes across. We, unlike any other species with that long life stage, or the higher number of life stages, having 5 life stages, we really have that need to care for our children for such an extended period of time that we really have that need to have so many people provide that care. Again, you're not sending one person out to get water, you need 3 or 4. And that's small end, right? That's small scale. You need 3 or 4. You need at least 5 people out gathering. You need at least 5 to 10 people out hunting. And then you need at least a couple of people who are able to stay at home and take care of the kids in the cave if you're still in a cave. You need at least one person that is there tending the fire. Now that person can tend the fire and tend the kid, but you still need at least one person back. So you're looking at, at minimum, you're needing at least 30 people. And that's the minimum. We're going to struggle to get by and hope that we can defend ourselves. And remember that this isn't defense against other humans. That doesn't come until much later, when the narcissistic God kings and the control of you comes into play. But that early defense is really defense from the land, really defense from the predators around us before we are the apex predator. So we need that defense, and we need large community for that defense. And it really becomes ingrained in everything about us. We not only need it for our defense, but we need it to teach our children. We need it to ensure that our children make it to that 25-year mark, to that full adult mark. And that comes in so many different forms of nurturing. It's nurturing to teach a child to hunt. It's nurturing to teach a child to flint knap. It's nurturing to teach a child how to build a fire. It's nurturing to teach a child how to skin an animal and how to make leather. It is nurturing to teach a child how to sew. All of these things are nurturing. It doesn't matter what job you're doing, teaching it to a child is nurturing that child and nurturing the next generation, ensuring our survivability as a species. And that's really what this gets into, is that it's all about our survivability of the species. But as a species, we must nurture. We must have community. The idea that we're like cats or like snakes and like pump and dock, pump, dump and walk away is impossible. We cannot continue our species like that because our species won't survive. Our species needs multiple adults, multiple people to ensure that the child makes it to adulthood, right? And you need multiple people to ensure a child. You're not looking at everybody having a child at the same time. You're not looking at 5 toddlers. You're not looking at a bunch of kids growing up together. You're looking at, one every few years, because you're looking at the need to protect and provide protection from all of those for any child. You're looking at the need to ensure that you have enough people to provide that nurturing and that growth and that stability for a child. Um, so you find that there's this absolute need to push that forward for us as a species in community. That the only way that we can push it forward as a species is within community. And it is when we start isolating, it is this space that we're in now where we think that, where we've made isolation kind of God in some ways. Like it's a positive thing, and do not get me wrong. I might end up being a hermit someday. I'm totally down. It seems like a great life. Sometimes. Uh, Yet it is isolation that I don't know where you live, but I know where I live, that isolation for 2 years, people have kind of gone insane. Nobody thinks about each other. Nobody, I mean, like, I don't go outside without seeing 3 almost wrecks, Everybody's impatient. Nobody cares. It seems like we've forgotten. And it was there a lot beforehand. It just seems to be increasing. And that is isolation. It is telling people that a two-parent household with nobody else in it is is the positive. It is telling people that one person's supposed to go out and earn all the income and the other person's supposed to stay at home and take care of all of the house and everything else. It is isolating people like that and taking away our multi-generational families, taking away our help, our care for each other, that really creates a lot of the mental health issues that we have, right? Um, when you put the stress of raising 10 kids on a singular human being because the other one's out of the house all the time, you turn otherwise decent human beings into horrific human beings because they're constantly exhausted. They can't function, right? Can't function. So that isolation really creates that isolation is also found in that othering, that need to other and to isolate us from each other to kind of maintain that control. I am going to go ahead and take off. Again, I will try and come live again in the evening this week. I'm going to try and do a couple evening lives and a couple of morning lives. Might do an afternoon lives, but I'm going to try and mix it up and make sure that I come on in some different times to make sure that I get to everybody's time zone. I hope everybody has a wonderful evening. Before I leave, I want to remind everybody that we are nurturing and we are communal. We are creative and we need each other. And in a time when the world is exploding, when you feel depressed, when you feel disconnected, when you feel lonely, even when you feel you're the problem, those that are the problem aren't going to feel lonely. The depression, the hurt, the loneliness, the fault that you feel is not because of you, it is because of the society around you. And only healthy people can, unhealthy people don't feel depression when the world's burning. Unhealthy people think everything's okay. Healthy people see people in pain. Awesome. Healthy people see people in pain and feel depression and overwhelmed. So if you think you're the problem today, you are not. Those who are the problem cannot perceive themselves to be the problem. Anybody who perceives that they might be the problem is not. Is not. Um, if you are exhausted and depressed, you're overwhelmed, if you look around you and you see this entire shit show and you don't know how you can make it, I ask you and implore you to continue, because you are what's healing us and you are what's saving us. Not as a savior complex kind of bullshit, but as seeing what's going on and doing everything in your power to ensure other people are safe. Because that's the vast majority of people feeling that deep loneliness and that pain and depression. And I want to remind you all that you're worthy, that you're needed, that you're a valued and important member of our world. Simply because you see that there's problem and you want to change it. Simply because you breathe. Simply because you exist. And the idea that you need to be something for anybody else is a crock of shit put into place to make you exploitable, make you into something that can be mined so that they can get the most that they can before they discard us all like husks. Remember, you are valued and worthy, and that you are needed. Much love to everybody. Much love. I will be back probably in the morning tomorrow. And I will be trying to pop in and out all week. I need to also work on the book thing, the kids' book thing. So I got to take some time this week to actually, I've been planning on, and I just haven't. So we might do that a little bit. Take care, everybody. Have a great night. Much love, everybody. Much love, YouTube. Have a great night.